The Beckham family did not become a global institution by accident. Their rise was the result of deliberate choices, careful timing, and an unusually disciplined approach to public life. Long before the term personal brand became a requirement for celebrities, David and Victoria Beckham were already operating as a coordinated unit, treating visibility, access, and image as assets to be managed rather than byproducts of fame. Their partnership emerged at a moment when sport, pop culture, and tabloid media were beginning to merge into a single attention economy, and they adapted faster than almost anyone else. David Beckham entered that space as more than a footballer. His success at Manchester United and later Real Madrid positioned him as a global athlete at a time when football was expanding aggressively into international markets. Victoria Beckham, transitioning from pop stardom after the Spice Girls, brought an intuitive understanding of fashion, branding, and media narrative. Together, they created a family image that felt aspirational but controlled, glamorous but structured. Every public appearance reinforced the idea of unity, discipline, and shared purpose. Over time, this image evolved into something larger than a celebrity marriage. Brand Beckham became a shorthand for reliability and cohesion. Sponsorships, fashion ventures, licensing deals, and ambassador roles all benefited from the perception that the family functioned as a single, aligned entity. Even moments of public strain, such as tabloid scrutiny or career transitions, were absorbed into the broader narrative without lasting damage. The family's strength appeared not just emotional, but operational. As their children grew up, that same structure extended to the next generation. Brooklyn Beckham, as the eldest, became the most visible extension of the brand. His childhood unfolded in full view of the public, documented through red carpet appearances, family campaigns, and curated social media moments. From an early age, his presence reinforced continuity, the idea that the Beckham legacy would carry forward seamlessly. Expectations formed around him long before he had the opportunity to define himself independently. This visibility, however, coincided with a major shift in how celebrity culture operates. Unlike his parents, who rose in an era of controlled media access, Brooklyn came of age in a digital environment where audiences respond instantly and critically. Social platforms removed the buffer that publicists once provided. Every career experiment, every post, and every personal decision became open to real-time judgment. The same brand infrastructure that once protected the family now amplified scrutiny. Brooklyn's attempts to establish a professional identity reflected this tension. His early interest in photography, followed by ventures into cooking and lifestyle content, were presented publicly as creative exploration, yet they were also received through the lens of privilege. The term Nepo baby, which gained traction across social media, attached itself to his name with persistence. Unlike his parents, whose rise was framed as earned and hard-fought, Brooklyn's efforts were often evaluated against the scale of the platform he inherited. This context matters because it shaped the power dynamics within the family long before any public conflict emerged. The Beckham model relies on alignment. Individual identity has historically existed within the framework of the family brand rather than outside it. For David and Victoria, this approach worked because their ambitions moved in the same direction. For a child raised inside that system, the balance between support and autonomy becomes more difficult to maintain, especially once external validation enters the picture. That balance shifted further when Brooklyn formed a serious relationship with Nicola Peltz. Unlike previous partners, Nicola came from a family with its own substantial wealth, influence, and internal structure. Her background altered the existing hierarchy in subtle but meaningful ways. For the first time, Brooklyn had access to a parallel support system that did not depend on his parents' network. Financial independence, social capital, and legal resources existed outside the Beckham ecosystem. From the outside, the relationship appeared to be another chapter in a carefully managed family story. Engagement announcements, wedding planning, and public appearances followed the familiar rhythms of celebrity life. Internally, however, the alignment that had defined Brand Beckham for decades was no longer guaranteed. Two powerful family systems were now intersecting, each with its own expectations, values, and boundaries. Public attention initially focused on surface-level details, fashion choices, seating arrangements, and perceived slights. These moments were easy for audiences to consume and for media outlets to frame as personality clashes. Yet beneath those narratives sat a more structural tension. The Beckham brand had always operated on proximity and visibility. Nicola's family, by contrast, did not rely on public cohesion in the same way. Privacy and legal clarity carried more weight than performative unity. As the wedding approached and later unfolded, observers began to notice small inconsistencies. Absences that would once have been unremarkable were now interpreted as signals. Social media interactions were parsed for meaning, silence became a statement. In an era where family identity had been part of the product, deviation was impossible to hide. What makes this situation distinct is not the presence of conflict, but the erosion of narrative control. The Beckhams built their influence by shaping perception over time. The digital environment that surrounds their children operates differently. It rewards fragmentation, reaction, and speculation. Once audiences sense a fracture, they amplify it, often beyond the intentions of those involved. At this stage, the story is not about conclusions or blame, it is about context. A family that once represented total alignment is now navigating a landscape where individual autonomy competes with collective identity. Power within the Beckham empire has historically flowed from unity. Any challenge to that structure, intentional or not, alters the balance. The introduction of new wealth, new legal frameworks, and new generational expectations has complicated a system that thrived on predictability. Whether the family adapts or fractures further remains to be seen. What is clear is that the conditions that once made Brand Beckham untouchable no longer exist in the same form. This is the backdrop against which the current situation must be understood. Not as a sudden collapse, but as the slow exposure of limits within a model built for a different era. As the public image of the Beckham family continued to rest on cohesion and discipline, the private dynamics surrounding Brooklyn's marriage began to shift in ways that were difficult to contain. What initially appeared as minor disagreements gradually accumulated into patterns that suggested deeper strain. These developments did not surface all at once. Instead, they emerged through fragmented reports, selective silences, and increasingly indirect communication. The wedding to Nicola Peltz in 2022 marked a clear turning point. Publicly, the event was framed as a lavish celebration uniting two influential families. Media coverage focused on spectacle, the location, the guest list, and the scale of wealth involved. Privately, however, accounts began to circulate suggesting that preparations had been marked by tension rather than collaboration. Central to these accounts was the question of control, specifically who held influence over decisions that traditionally symbolize family alignment. Discussions around Nicola's wedding dress became an early flashpoint. Initial explanations emphasized logistics and scheduling, framing the outcome as a misunderstanding rather than a dispute. Over time, alternative versions of events appeared, describing the breakdown as symptomatic of broader communication failures. While no single detail fully explained the rift, the persistence of the issue suggested that expectations on both sides had diverged well before the ceremony took place. The reception itself later became another focal point in the narrative. Accounts described moments that were intended to be private and symbolic, but instead felt performative and disruptive to those involved. These claims framed the wedding not as a resolution of family dynamics, but as an event where unresolved tensions became impossible to ignore. What mattered was less the specific incident and more the interpretation, that traditional family roles were being asserted in ways that no longer aligned with Brooklyn's sense of autonomy. Following the wedding, observers began to notice changes in behavior that reinforced the perception of distance. Brooklyn and Nicola appeared less frequently at Beckham-centered events. When they did appear, interactions were limited and often carefully framed. Social media, once a tool of cohesion for the family, became a space of absence. Birthdays passed without public acknowledgement. Milestones were marked separately rather than collectively. Behind these visible shifts, reports suggested that communication itself had become strained. Informal contact gave way to more deliberate boundaries. The tone of interaction reportedly changed from familial to procedural. Rather than resolving disagreements through conversation, the situation moved toward documentation and distance. This shift marked a significant departure from the family's long-standing emphasis on constant connection. As months passed, the absence of Brooklyn and Nicola from key family moments drew increasing attention. David Beckham's milestone birthday celebration became one such example. In earlier years, such events would have served as reaffirmation of unity. This time, the absence was interpreted as intentional rather than coincidental. Attempts to explain it as scheduling conflict failed to quiet speculation, particularly given reports that the couple was in the same city at the time. Around the same period, Brooklyn and Nicola quietly renewed their vows in a private ceremony. The absence of Beckham family members from that event further reinforced the sense that the relationship dynamics had shifted decisively. While vow renewals are not uncommon among public figures, the context in which this one occurred gave it additional weight. It appeared less as a celebration and more as a reassertion of boundaries. Parallel to these developments were reports that Brooklyn had begun to reassess his relationship with the family brand itself. His public statements increasingly emphasized personal well-being and independence rather than collective identity. References to anxiety and pressure suggested that the cost of maintaining alignment had become unsustainable. These remarks did not directly accuse his parents of wrongdoing, but they reframed the narrative of support into one of obligation. Allegations concerning legal and financial pressures added another layer of complexity. Reports suggested that discussions around naming rights and brand control had taken place prior to the wedding. While details remained contested, the implication was that business considerations had intruded into what Brooklyn viewed as personal decisions. The presence of legal frameworks within family interactions marked a profound change in tone. As these allegations circulated, responses from the Beckham side remained measured and indirect. Statements emphasized love, concern, and the challenges of parenting adult children in the public eye. Rather than engaging with specific claims, the focus stayed on general principles: patience, understanding, and the belief that family disagreements evolve over time. This contrast in communication styles, one side articulating distance and relief, the other emphasizing continuity and restraint, deepened the sense of unresolved conflict. Each public remark, however limited, was interpreted through an increasingly polarized lens. Supporters of Brooklyn framed his actions as necessary self-preservation. Defenders of David and Victoria viewed the situation as a painful but temporary estrangement. What became clear during this phase was that the conflict was no longer contained within private family space. It had entered the public domain, shaped by legal language, media interpretation, and digital speculation. The structures that once allowed the Beckhams to manage narrative flow were now competing with a decentralized attention economy that rewards exposure over resolution. At this stage, no definitive outcome had emerged. The situation remained fluid, defined more by tension than by closure. Each development added context but not clarity, leaving the central questions unanswered: whether reconciliation was possible, and whether the framework that sustained brand Beckham could adapt to a model that allowed genuine independence. The implications of the Beckham family dispute extend beyond the immediate personalities involved and into broader questions about power, identity, and the limits of brand-managed intimacy. What was once presented as an idealized model of family unity has become an example of how public success can complicate private relationships, particularly when personal autonomy collides with long-standing systems of control. At the center of this situation is the tension between individual self-definition and collective legacy. For decades, the Beckham family operated as a tightly coordinated unit, with shared appearances, synchronized messaging, and a clear hierarchy of influence. That structure proved effective in maintaining public admiration and commercial value. However, it also relied on an assumption that alignment would continue across generations. Brooklyn's actions suggest that this assumption may no longer hold in an environment where adult children are expected to assert independence earlier and more visibly than in the past. The introduction of legal boundaries into what was previously a personal relationship marks a significant shift. When communication moves from informal conversation to formal documentation, it signals not only a breakdown in trust, but also a redefinition of roles. Parents accustomed to guiding narrative and access are confronted with limits they cannot override through reputation or influence. For a family whose identity was built on constant proximity, this change represents a structural rupture rather than a temporary disagreement. Public reaction to the dispute highlights a broader cultural divide. Some observers view Brooklyn's separation as a reasonable assertion of adulthood, particularly in light of the pressures associated with growing up under constant scrutiny. Others see it as an overcorrection, shaped by privilege and external influence rather than necessity. The absence of complete information ensures that both interpretations persist, reinforced by selective reporting and online speculation. For David and Victoria Beckham, the situation presents an unfamiliar challenge: the loss of narrative authority. Their responses, measured and restrained, reflect an awareness that direct confrontation could deepen the divide. Yet restraint also leaves space for alternative accounts to dominate public perception. In an era where silence is often interpreted as avoidance, the choice not to engage carries its own risks. The long-term significance of this conflict lies in what it reveals about the sustainability of family as brand models. As public figures increasingly monetize intimacy and unity, the boundaries between business strategy and emotional reality become harder to maintain. When those boundaries fail, the fallout is amplified by the same platforms that once supported cohesion. Whether reconciliation occurs remains uncertain. What is clear is that the framework that defined the Beckham family's public identity has been permanently altered. Even if personal relationships are repaired, the assumption of seamless unity has been replaced by a more complex, fragmented reality. The family's story now includes separation, negotiation, and contested narratives alongside success. This episode also underscores a generational shift in how legacy is perceived. For Brooklyn, legacy appears less about inheritance and more about autonomy. For his parents, legacy has long been tied to continuity and shared representation. These differing priorities are not easily reconciled, particularly when played out in full public view. Ultimately, the Beckham situation illustrates the limits of control in a digital and legal age. Wealth, influence, and careful image management can shape perception, but they cannot fully contain personal dissent. As the family navigates this unresolved chapter, the outcome will likely influence how other public figures approach the balance between unity and independence. What remains unresolved is not simply whether the family will reunite, but whether the model that sustained their rise can adapt to a reality where individual agency outweighs collective presentation. In that sense, the significance of this conflict extends beyond one family, offering a case study in the evolving relationship between fame, power, and personal freedom.